Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. You can this is Some Christian Guy, and you can find me on Facebook under the same name, Some Christian Guy, oneway.com/media, and you can find me on YouTube as well. Most of you are probably watching this on YouTube. So today I'm going to be talking about Easter, right? Because as I'm sure most of you have noticed, anyone that uses social media or goes to church or whatever the case might be, the argument is already going on about whether we should be celebrating Easter or not. Is it pagan, etc. So I want to get to the bottom of this, all right? I want to. You're never going to settle the issue. That's just one of those things. But I want to give a rational, sort of a decent account of where this whole thing comes from. Now, the reason why this is a bit of a consternation is because people, for the most part, they link it to certain pagan origins and all that kind of stuff, and as a result, we are then told, "Oh, it's pagan," and you know, Christianity is invalid, and all these kinds of things, because the secular view, right? If you accept the secular worldview, for example, the whole sense of anthropology, the origins, it's everything is developed from one place, as it's, you know, our ancient hominids, and then they all came and all developed, and everything comes out of the same place. And there is this idea that Christianity, because it's later than some other religions and stuff like that, that Christianity comes and borrows from other religions in order to be formed, and but in that sense, they completely ignore the fact that the Jewish tradition is absolutely ancient as well, and a lot of this stuff is based on them trying to find parallels, not because they're actually interested in any kind of theology whatsoever. They're just being ridiculous, but because they want to find ways to discredit Christianity as something completely different, completely new. So they try to find spurious parallels and all these kinds of things, and say, "Oh, you know, look, they just borrowed," right? And that mostly comes from a complete ignorance of what it is that Christianity teaches versus what paganism actually teaches. Now, for the sake of some audience members, because I know a lot of people struggle with things that are too abstract and all that kind of stuff, maybe get a little bit bored of talking, so I got myself a whiteboard. I feel like a teacher, and I'm just gonna jot a couple of things down here. Now, where is my eraser, my whiteboard eraser? Got this yesterday, actually. So here's the issue, right? Now we've got Easter, right? Now this is actually quite difficult to. I'm practicing, by the way. So we're going to start off with Easter, right? Where does Easter come from, right? What is its origin? The origin story, like X-Men Origins and comic books and all that kind of stuff. What happened here? Okay, now, a lot of people look at the word Easter, right? And they see a parallel, because this is an English word, right? Easter, it's what we call it in English. They see that there's a parallel to the word. Let me have a quick look up here, right? So I've got my references. So can you see that, right? Estre, or you have the same, but right now these are Germanic words, right? Now this makes sense, right? Because English comes from Old High German, right? That's where English comes from. Okay, so it makes sense that there would be some Germanic derivations within the English language. You know, fair enough. Now, Estre, or Ostre, or however you want to pronounce it, I'm not German, you must notice is, a lot of people notice, is a pagan goddess, right? Pagan pagan goddess, right? Haha. Bear with me, right? I'm getting used to this still. So as a pagan goddess, right? And I hope you can read my handwriting. So there we go, right? Is a pagan goddess. Now, what comes here, right? So they assume that this, because Easter is the English, because English comes from Germanic, and in Germanic is this, they assume that this is here, right? Is the origin. But this is actually false, because let me show you something interesting, right? Now, let's go to my trusted internet source, right? Where was the Judeo-Christian religion founded? It was founded down here, right? Whoops, I'm moving the wrong thing. Aren't I stupid, right? It was formed down here, okay? This is where Judeo-Christianity emerged, and from here spread out. And people are saying that the tradition comes from Germanic roots. So this is what Germany is nowadays. Obviously it didn't look this way, but the Germanic tribes sort of floated around this region here. So you're trying to, what people are trying to tell you is that, right, a religion that was born here is it's borrowing pagan roots from here. Okay, really? You want us to take this seriously? Okay, so now this is the assertion. Okay, this is the assertion. All right. So we have to look at the context and the origin story of where the religion actually, it's like miles away from each other. Now, the early church spoke two languages. Okay, the early church came out, right, of the Roman Empire. My spelling is shocking today, right? So, Roman Empire, right? And we know Jesus was born under the Herod, who was the Jewish leader at the time, and he was sort of a proxy, sort of vassal, subservient to Rome, sort of thing, right? Now, and he actually persecuted people and stuff. Jesus had to flee. So Christianity arises in the context not only of its Jewish roots, but at the time, Jerusalem and the whole Jewish people, they were under Roman occupation. Okay, now what language did they speak? They spoke Latin. Okay, they spoke Latin and Greek. The early church cultural and linguistic milieu was Latin and Greek. Okay, for the most part. Okay, what language is our New Testament in? It's in Greek. Okay, and we've got early Latin versions and so on and so forth. It makes sense. So I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this, right? So this is the origin, right? Now, okay, the Easter tradition, what does it have to do with? Okay, it has to do with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, obviously. Okay, so people go and they want to say, oh, well, the resurrection of Jesus Christ has to do with the cycle of death and rebirth and all that kind of stuff. That's rubbish, right? Because what is the Greek and Latin word for Easter, right? They don't call it this in Latin and Greek. They call it, let me use a different color, shall I? They call it Pascha. Let me make sure I've got it correct here on my sources. Right? Just to make sure I really, yeah, that's spelled correct, except I'm missing an S. Right? Pascha, and Now, anyone that speaks any Latin languages, right, will know. So, for example, if I take Portuguese and Spanish both inherit the language from Latin, right? The Latin. So Pasha is in both Latin and Greek is spelled the same way. The Greek, obviously, if you transliterate it into the alphabetic code which we use in English, which is common to the Latin but is not common to the Greek. Obviously, they've got some very strange symbols and all that kind of stuff. Looks like you're reading in code, some sort of code, right? So in Portuguese, for example, which is my native tongue, it's called there's a little copy there. It's called Pascua, right? That's what we call it in Portuguese. And in Spanish, it's exactly the same. So if you look at all the Latin languages, it's spelt exactly the same. So the French is also very, very similar. Let me have a look see here just to make sure. The French pronounce it for the French. Forgive me if I'm incorrect here, but the French have a Q in there somewhere. So it's Pasqua or something like that. They've got a Q in there. So it's all exactly the same. That is the cultural milieu, right, which Easter comes into, right? It's Roman and Greek early church tradition. Now, at some point, so we know that at the moment, right, starting on Monday or something like that, we know that we are now celebrating what we call Holy Week, right? So Holy Week is now, when you read the Bible, Holy Week is when Jesus is now in Jerusalem, and it's the whole week leading up to the Passover, because we know that this falls in the time of the Passover. Now, what does the Passover have to do with anything, right? So we know at the end of this week, before Jesus is crucified, we have the Lord's Supper. So Jesus says, hey, he breaks the bread and has the wine. He says, "This is my body. This is my blood that is spilt," and all that kind of stuff for your salvation, right? Because it's a whole salvation theme. Now, Jesus is also known as the Lamb, right? Jesus is also known as the Lamb of God. Now, why is this relevant? Okay, because the lamb was the sacrificial animal of choice within the Jewish system that preceded Christianity. Now, here's the connection. The Lord's Supper, because here's the thing, why did Jesus choose, let's say, why does prophecy indicate and necessitate that Jesus be born and in the time that he did, and everything leads up so that he dies in Passover, Pascua week, Passover? So what does the Passover have to do with anything? Passover, right? Passover. What does it mean to be passed over? People get very irritated if they're passed over for promotion at work, right? It means that something that is coming towards you, or that you expect should be due to you, is instead not given to you. It's not given to you. So the Passover feast for the Jews is a celebration of when their time in Egypt, when they were delivered from Egypt, and they had, so what happens is, part of the plagues, the whole plagues issue, right, is Jesus said to the people, just as they were about to leave Egypt, their captivity in Egypt, right? So we need to think about typology, right? When we're talking about the Bible and typology, the actual story, the real story, the actual occurrence has a greater illustration, as it were, a sort of a metaphorical type that it refers to in the future. So Passover, so what they had to do in the Passover is, the instruction was, the angel of death was going to come and it was going to kill the firstborn, and so on and so forth, right? And in order for the Jewish people to avoid this, they had to kill, right, the lamb, the Passover lamb. So we talk about the Passover lamb, and the blood of the lamb had to be sprinkled on their doorways, right? So here's the door, right? And there's their little house, okay, their little slave shack. And so they killed the lamb, right? And they had to sprinkle the blood, not green blood. So they had to sprinkle the blood on the doorway, And when the angel of death came by and saw the blood of the lamb, what is the lamb? It's the Lamb of God. So this is a typological, how can you say, an object lesson of the sacrifice that Jesus Christ was going to make for our sins, so that when death is due to us, we would be passed over because we have the blood of our lamb on our lives, and so we are spared from death, because what does the Bible say? It says the wages of sin is death. So this doesn't only trace back to the Latin origins. This goes even further to the Passover, which is why Jesus died on Passover week. It all converges onto that Passover week. It's not by random that Jesus died during Passover. Okay, there's a reason for that. It's not random. So when the angel of death came, the house of the faithful that had the blood on their doorway, right, would be passed over, so that only the people who didn't believe in the warning, which was a lot of Egyptians, their firstborn and so on and so forth, they died. And the reason why it's the firstborn is because Jesus is also said to be the only begotten Son of God. Okay, and so there's a very, very interesting typology there. So your firstborn is spared, right? So that's also making a distinction between spurious gods versus the actual God. So the actual Son of God that died versus the spurious firstborn son, because there's a lot of other deities that have sons, right? So Osiris, Horus, and so on and so forth, that whole canard that people try to say. So it's making a distinction between the spurious sons of gods versus the actual son of the actual God of the Jewish people, right? So that's where the Passover comes into, okay? So that's what the Jewish people are celebrating at the Passover, was this event, and this eventually led, right, the king of Egypt to say, right, I will let them go. And the king of Egypt is actually typologically Satan, right, as it were, because Satan and sin and all that kind of stuff is holding us in bondage, is holding us in slavery to sin. And the Lamb, Jesus Christ, comes and spares us and then sets us free. Okay, so that is the cultural milieu. That's what precedes it. Now, when was Easter, right, sort of made to be on Sunday in the way that we know it today? It was done at the First Council of Nicaea. So, First Council of Nicaea in 325, right, AD. There we go. In 325 AD, Anno Domini. All right. So, prior to this, so when we look at 325 AD, right, dear Protestants, we need to realize that this happened before the schism, right? Because the Protestant Reformation recognized that the Western Church had become completely corrupt, and so we separated, right? Now, in the year 1054 was the Great Schism, where the Eastern Church and the Western Church split, okay? That was the Great Schism. So you then became the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Catholic Empire, so the Roman Catholicism, and then you had the Eastern Orthodoxy, which was had dominion in the Byzantine Empire, right? And so prior to that, even though the Western Church brought in a lot of funny things, they weren't fully far gone, right? Completely far gone. Here we're still dealing, in 325, we're still dealing with the early church, okay? And so it was still pretty decent and stuff like that. So they had an ecumenical council. Now, in those days, ecumenical council was all of the different Christian people, all in all the empire, in all the lands, would come together right? And they would meet up and they would discuss certain issues. So, for example, at the Council of Nicaea was also where the heretic Arius was eventually denounced, right? The whole Arian heresy was eventually sorted out at the Council of Nicaea, and they declared that to be a heresy and so on and so forth. They declared it in anathema, right? Because the Arians taught that Jesus Christ was actually a created creature and wasn't actually God. So this is where it was sorted out. Interestingly enough, if you guys look at my other video where I deal with Christmas, this Council of Nicaea is where Father Christmas or Saint Nicholas punched the heretic Arius, right? for these heresies. He's got really irritated with him and sort of punched him on the nose, and he actually got into quite a lot of trouble. So interestingly enough, Christmas actually in a way ties into this particular history, right? So that was the Great Schism. So this was 325. Council, they basically said, because what happens is and the reason why this was necessary, they basically decreed that it was going to be on the Sunday, right, of a specific week, because what happens is Passover for the Jews used to be on Nisan 14, right? Because they used to go, they went by sort of a Jewish sort of a lunar calendar, right? So what happens is at this point, sort of the East and West were in a bit of a dispute, because the East still had the Julian calendar, and they were going by the same tradition to observe not only the Holy Week, but to observe the Last Supper and all of that kind of stuff, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They would follow the way the Jews would determine the Passover. So they were actually known as the Quartodecims and so on and so forth. Whereas in the West, they wanted to fix it to a particular point on the calendar and so on and so forth. So at the Council of Nicaea, they then decreed, right, it's going to be on that particular Sunday, which is now April, and all that sort of thing. And that's then where it comes from, and why they made it on the Sunday. Okay. And then the Holy Week is whatever week precedes the Sunday, which it happens to fall on. So this idea that this has sweet nothing to do with that, okay? Because Easter comes from the Germanic, but the Germanic has nothing to do with the early traditions of the church, right? This only makes sense if you speak English, right? Or German, the old Germanic languages, not if you speak Latin and Greek, which is where or even Hebrew, which is where the early church came from. Okay? Get this into your heads. Now, interesting. Let's make some space. So you all got that, right? Okay. Right, you all got that. Now, here is some interesting tidbits of information. We have to now go into a little bit of some strange history. I'm just getting my sources right here. So interestingly enough, in the 8th century, there was a priest that suggested in England, right? This was now in England, that suggested that there was some sort of connection, but no one believes that anymore. Okay, we need to understand something. The whole canard about Christian traditions being derived from pagan ones comes from the mind of atheists who are attempting to discredit Christianity, first of all, and secondly, because the Catholic Church, the Western Roman Catholic Church, fell into such massive apostasy, right? When we look at things like the Frankish thesis, right? Because basically the Franks and the the kings and queens of France, the Merovingians, and all these people. There was all these sort of interesting intrigues and stuff like that went so corrupt, and they brought in a lot of really, really heretical, apostate, just absolute evil stuff, right, since the schism, right? And there, a lot of really, really pagan, really horrible stuff was actually brought into the church, and people do recognize that, which is one of the reasons why the Protestants recognize and say that this that the Roman Catholic Church is the Antichrist, is the beast system of Revelation and all that sort of thing, is this really, really massively heretical thing. Now, interestingly enough, the Protestant Reformation is basically just another schism. So you had the first schism, which was the East-West split, and then the Protestant Catholic split. Then later on in the 1600s, 1500s, and all that sort of thing, you know. And now the Protestants, wanting to go back to the original, should actually really have a serious, which they don't in a lot of ways, but should really have a serious look at what people were teaching in the first millennium of the church, because they were, for the most part, they were really fine. There was not a whole heck of a lot wrong. So now we have, where does the Easter bunny and the Easter eggs and all that kind of stuff come from? Okay, now now here's something we need to understand. As the church spread and people started accepting Christianity, right? And I explained this already in my Christmas video. People had already their customs and their cultural whatevers that they had wherever it was in the world, and so what they would do, even though they would accept Christianity, all of the symbols and all of the things that already made sense to them, they would just change the meaning of a lot of that stuff and then give a Christian thing to it. This is not necessarily because they're practicing any kind of syncretism or anything like that, but this is a culture accepting something new and building it in to the already pre-existing infrastructure that they had, and using sort of their already familiar surroundings in order to express the Christian ethics and things, which is fine, okay, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that, because they are actually abandoning the old customs. Now, here is the interesting thing. So, right, we had Lent. Right now we have Lent, which is the 40 days that precedes and all that kind of stuff. And Catholics have a lot of very strange, how can you say? They impose a lot of very strange rituals and things like for some reason, like you're only supposed to eat fish on a Friday night and all these kinds of things. And there's no real biblical basis for these things, but these come from traditions. It's like, yeah, okay, fine. If you want to do it, go ahead. But, you know, there's no real need to do it. So now, this whole idea of Easter eggs, right? Wow, that's a shocking Easter egg. So you have an egg, right? And let's decorate that. Let's have some. Right. Oh, let's use a little bit of blue. Use a little bit of blue. Right, and you have your Easter egg. So when did they start decorating the Easter egg? Right, when did this begin? Right, the earliest known record is in the 13th century. Right, the earliest known record. Okay, so 13th century. When was Easter ratified? 325, right? This is like 1,000 years, not 750 odd years later, okay? When the whole Easter thing started coming in, and by this point, the 13th century, okay, the schism had already happened. You already had the Frankish thesis. No, not quite yet. That was later, right? We're talking about the High Middle Ages. So we already had a major apostatizing of the Roman Catholic Church, right? Who, for the most part, in a lot of ways, completely abandoned orthodoxy for their own their own funny little things, right? So if you're having strange artifacts, it's not because it's orthodox to do so, right? It's later inventions that find their way into the tradition because that's what people do, okay? Right? So that's when Easter was sort of ratified. We're going to now do it on Sunday. But that came before and was already being practiced long before that in the Pasch. And the Jews have been doing the Passover since their captivity, thousands of years prior to this, okay? 13th century is the earliest record. And now for some strange reason, they prohibited the eating of eggs during the Holy Week. Okay, so now you're still a bit of an agrarian society. What are you going to do with all these eggs? Okay, right? Decorate them. So that's what they started doing. Okay, because the chickens, they don't know that they're not supposed to lay eggs because people are not going to eat them. The chickens are going to lay eggs anyway. They don't care. So these chickens are now laying. What are we going to do with these eggs? So they're right. Okay, let's decorate them, and that's where the egg come from. All right. So it's you know, there might be other peculiarities, cultural peculiarities attached to it, but we don't know. Now, here's the now here's also an interesting thing is because of certain cultural peculiarities, specifically in the north. In the north, the Easter falls around the time of spring and all that kind of stuff. So cultural peculiarities where people did sort of, because even in Christianity, for example, we have the and this comes from the agrarian societies, people who were farmers and herders and all these kinds of things, where they would celebrate, they would have festivities that would celebrate the coming of spring and the harvests and all these kinds of things that were going to start coming and all that kind of stuff, the new life and everything, the time of ease that was now coming, because spring and summer symbolize a time of ease, right? Back in those days, nowadays we live in nice little heated houses and all that kind of stuff, and it's all very great. In those days, autumn and winter were hell, were absolute hell. So the entry of spring was a time to be celebrated. So naturally, you're going to find whether it's pagans or whether it's Christians, they're both going to be very, very excited about the coming of spring. And so obviously you have pagan springtime festivities, but Christians have the same thing where they thank God because we believe that God is in charge of the seasons and all that kind of stuff. The Bible talks about the seasons. God is going to ensure that the seasons continue until the end of days, right? That God is in charge of this. So Thanksgiving, and there are traditions in Judaism. So before Jesus Christ came and all that kind of stuff, that was already back in the days of Moses and all of these kinds of people, where they had where they would give the first fruits, right, of their harvest and all that kind of stuff as Thanksgiving offerings. And also that's the origin of those kinds of celebrations that we still keep today, where we give the first fruits and we celebrate the new harvests and all these kinds of things back from those old traditions. So it's not a problem. It's not pagan. It's completely, it's what people were like. It's that cultural milieu where most people were farmers and peasants and all these kinds of things. Right, now here's the interesting thing. You have the Easter Bunny. Can you see my bunny? Right. Where did the Easter Bunny come from? Now, no one really knows, to be honest. But let me see if I can. Let me go through my records here. Right. The Easter Bunny did not come in. Now, there are two categories of people that kick up a real stink about Easter being pagan. You have the atheists, and who, they've got to be in their bonnet about Christianity, and they try to make it out like it's pathetic and all that kind of stuff. And who else kicks up a stink? Can you see? Protestants kick up a stink, right? Because Protestants have this massive bee in their bonnet about pagan idolatry, or because, and it makes sense because they came out of the Latin West. They're going to be very, very, very careful, paranoid even, about idolatry and anything that might have to do with pagans. Right. Now, the tradition of the the tradition of the Easter bunny in Easter, where did it come from? It was Protestants who did it, right? The Easter bunny in association with Easter did not happen prior to the 17th century. It was Protestants who did it. They're the ones that bitch about it the most, but they're the ones that brought in the Easter bunny. Right? And this is brilliant, okay? So, why did they do this? Okay? Because here's the thing. If we look at, if you guys want to go and look at my Christmas video, we know that the Protestants had such a problem with the Catholics and the way they did things and stuff like that, that it was actually Protestants that moved Christmas Day to the 25th, because they wanted to be unlike the Catholics, because the Catholics didn't always necessarily have it on the 25th. It was a whole feast festival that spanned several days that ended on about the 22nd or the 23rd or on the 24th, something like that, right? And then it was actually the Protestants who moved it over, because we want nothing to do with those Catholic pagan idolaters, right? So we're not going to do that. We're going to so this is the same thing, right? So what happens is, depending, and there's a lot of history with Easter egg hunts and stuff like that in the early 1800s and all that kind of stuff, sort of thing, but you don't see it prior to that. So what happens is, Protestants in Europe specifically brought about the Easter bunny. Okay, so why did they do this? Now, this practice did not become prominent until the 19th century. All right, so with the earliest known records, if we look back, is within Protestantism in the 17th century, but it did not become common practice until the 19th century. Okay, so this idea that the Easter bunny is some pagan thing that comes from the origins somewhere back in the first millennia of the church is just complete utter garbage. It's nonsense. Okay, the 19th century. Now, why did they do this? Okay, so let's have a quick squiz here in my notes. So why did they do this? Again, because they wanted to move away from Catholicism, and Catholicism has, especially in Europe, right, the cockerel was a big symbol in sort of so the chicken, right? So for example, if you think about the Barcelos chicken in the Portuguese culture, right, the chicken is a symbol. So in order, as sort of a knee-jerk reaction, they then adopted the Easter bunny instead, that was going to go give out all of the Easter eggs and all the presents and stuff like that, because the chicken was something they wanted to. Who knows, really? I mean, in a lot of ways, these things are lost to history, why and who and where it precisely it started. Now, here's the interesting thing. The Easter bunny is not universal, right? Some Protestants adopted the Easter bunny, but if we look at places like, so let me have a look at my notes here, because they wanted to reject the Catholic Easter customs. So this was it, right? So in Switzerland, Switzerland, right? In Switzerland, they have the cuckoo, right? They had the cuckoo, not the Easter bunny, right? The Protestants there. And in Westphalia, they had the fox instead. All right, so it's not universal, right? The Easter bunny is not universal. So depending where the Protestants were, depending on the culture milieu, right, and whatever sort of animals and things that they were exposed to and all that kind of stuff, right? Again, it's a cultural peculiarity, not necessarily a pagan thing, that they had either the Easter bunny, or they had the Easter cuckoo, or they had the fox, depending on where in Europe you go, right? Not a problem. And the reason why they did that is because they wanted to reject the Catholic Easter, right? The Catholic Easter traditions, right? So, let's put that away. Ladies and gentlemen, that is where we get Easter from, right? It is not pagan, right? Because you get a lot of people that do. I can't tell you how many people I've had come to me with this kind of stupid, narrow-minded reasoning. Well, because the English word sounds like this word over there, it must be pagan, right? Like, for example, another absurdity people come to me with. They say, "Oh, the word Gad, G-A-D, appears in the Bible. It was a pagan city, right? And Gad was, and the city was so named because there was a pagan god called Gad, right? Or Gad, right? Is how they pronounce it in the old, right? The Gad, right? And what does Gad sound a lot like, right? It sounds like God, okay? So now, because some Semites somewhere, right, had had a word for their God that sounds like God in the English, which doesn't come from the Semite root, it comes from the Germanic root. Now God and the leap in mental gymnastics is just unbelievable. All right, so this is this kind of totally idiotic reasoning that people have when they try to link, you know, these conspiracies. It's idiotic. Okay, stop it. Okay, just stop it. Right. So when you see some idiot, right, who's well-meaning, okay, people are well-meaning. I understand why people do that, because in my earlier years, when I first became a Christian, I also had a lot of knee-jerk reactions. Whereas, like, if I'm not sure about the legitimacy of this particular thing, I'm going to recoil. I don't want to go there, okay? And so initially I rejected the Easter celebrations. I rejected the Christmas celebration. I thought I would rather abstain than do something wrong, and that's my nature, right? I'm the type of person where for the most part I tend to err on the side of caution. That's just how I am. And I used to challenge a lot of people throughout my whole Christian development. I used to challenge people and say, why do you believe that these things are okay? Why do you believe these things are not okay? And I used to try to get answers from both sides. And 99.999% of the arguments that I used to get were just utterly pathetic. Just utterly pathetic. Because who knows? Because people are ignorant of the history. You know, most Protestants have no idea what happened in the first millennia of the church, sort of thing. We you know, for all we know is Luther and Calvin. That's all we know, right? Not to mention that there were other reformers that most people have no idea. If you mention who was Knox and who was Melanchthon and who was whoever, you know, Wesley, you know, the odd person might, but in general they have no idea, sort of thing. You know, no clue who even their own Protestant reformers, for the most part, have no idea who they were, right? Sort of thing. The level of abject ignorance, historical ignorance within Protestantism specifically, it's profound. It really is profound. And so you get these wild, ridiculous assertions and these things. And every Easter, every Christmas, every frickin' holiday that comes by, you always have these two factions within the church go at each other in completely idiotic ways over whether we should or should not and stuff like that. Now, obviously, and this should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, all the commercialism Christians should avoid the commercialism that is associated with the holiday, right? Because the whole secular world has gone and this is great, right? This is great. We're gonna secularize the living hell out of it, and we're gonna monetize, right? The capitalist ethic. We're gonna monetize. We're gonna just sell garbage, so just sweets and movies and commercialize the hell out of it, right? And people go and they stuff their faces full of food, and they do, it's obscene, right? If you're a Christian, stay away from that garbage, okay? Do the Easter celebration, but be mindful of why it's there, right? Holy Week, meditate on that journey that Jesus had up until he eventually crucified. Meditate on those biblical themes, and maybe you would become a little bit of a better Christian who actually understands his own faith at the end of the day, sort of thing. And it's, but go and meditate properly on these things instead of all this other nonsense, okay? And having these petty, ridiculous squabbles and you're a pagan if you celebrate Easter, sort of thing, right? Just get over yourself, okay? If you are this naysayer that wants to say it's pagan, right? And also, if you are in favor, right, because this is both sides. The reason why there's this misunderstanding is because those for and those against are both utterly ignorant of the origins of the roots. That's why they're completely ignorant, right? So you basically have two ignorants arguing over something that neither of them know anything about, and that's why you have the problems, right? So those of you who are for, know properly why, get into the history, okay? And those of you who are against, well, if you're against it, well, then you are going, not only are you making the atheist case, right? If you're against the Easter celebrations, not only are you making the atheist case against Christianity for the most part, right? You are doing so in complete and utter contradiction to the testimony of history and the formulation of church tradition and creeds and things like that in the first millennia of the church development, right? You're denying the Passover. You are denying the week that Christ spent in the Garden of Gethsemane and all of these kinds of things prior to his whole issue, that whole preparation, that Christ knowing that he was going to die, right? Because Christ knew, okay, knowing what was in store for him, feeling completely abandoned because his disciples didn't understand. They didn't understand, right? They fell asleep, right? Meditate on these things, what it must have been like for Christ, what it must have been like for him to have to go and face this alone, knowing what he was going to, right? And get maybe a little bit of appreciation for what this whole business is about, and then go and then celebrate the Last Supper, the communion, right? For Protestants, it's the communion. For the Orthodox and the Catholics, it's the Eucharist, right? And I'm not going to get into those issues, but go and do that in whatever way that you do it. Go and do that, and be mindful of what it's there for, what it's about, what it's trying to tell you, rather than getting to this other petty, stupid nonsense and the commercialism and all that sort of all that stuff, right? Chasing around red herrings, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this clears it up for you. I hope this sorts it out for you, right? Once and for all, let's stop arguing about this rubbish, okay? And I wish every single one of you an absolute blessed Easter holiday, right? And God bless, and meditate on the wonderful sacrifice that he made in order to save you and I, us miserable, silly people who fight over rubbish. Right? God bless. Cheerio.